13 chilling haunted house stories that will haunt your dreams forever. At 4 a.m., the pounding wasn't a polite knock. It came like someone demanding entry, sharp, impatient, impossible to ignore. That sound is the shape of what keeps people awake, a single noise that refuses explanation, then the small, stubborn facts that don't line up with any reasonable story. I didn't used to believe in this sort of thing. I liked a tidy explanation, plumbing, pranksters, a dream that crossed into waking. Lately, after listening to dozens of first-hand accounts, after driving through neighborhoods that seemed to remember more than the people who lived there, my skepticism thinned. Not because any single event proved anything, but because so many different voices pointed to the same cold, hollow seam running through ordinary houses, an unease that can't be filed away as coincidence. These are 13 stories from people who slept under the same roof as the unknown. They were submitted in whispers and emails and late-night messages. I am only the one who tells them back to you. If this kind of late-night chill is your thing, hit subscribe. It's the best way to keep getting stories like these. Check the description for a trailer and timestamps if you want to skip around. 1. A narrow row house, city late at night. A man who worked nights as a mechanic, single, sleeping in after a graveyard shift. He woke to a sound like fists on wood, the kind of knocking that can't be explained by delivery drivers or wind. It came in a slow, steady rhythm, 3 sharp knocks, a pause, then 4 more. He got up, checked the front door, then the hallway. It was locked, the deadbolt held. Whoever was making that noise wasn't at the door. He called his neighbor. She swore she hadn't heard anything and that her TV had been on all night. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. He went back to bed and tried to shrug it off. 2 nights later, the fridge was unplugged. Not merely off, completely unplugged. The cord looped and tucked behind the appliance in a way that would have required crawling into the small space behind the unit. He lived alone. He had not done it. The next morning, food had spoiled, but the clock on the microwave still remembered the late hour, frozen at 4:13 a.m. Over the following weeks, things moved. A favorite mug on the counter would be found at the opposite end of the kitchen. A thick coat, left on a hook, would be lying on the closet floor. His tools, organized with a careful mechanic's pride, would be scattered like small bones across the workbench. The first night the knocking had woken him, he had laughed in the darkness and told whatever might be listening to find itself a better hobby. That laugh left an odd taste in his mouth, as if his voice had been swallowed by the house. He started sleeping with the bedroom light on. He stopped leaving the door unlocked even during the day. Friends told him he should see someone, that stress will do strange things. He booked an appointment, but cancelled the first time, then the second. No one knows what the knocks were. He sleeps with the TV on now, the glow like a weak shield against sound. That was only the beginning. 2. A third-floor apartment above a deli. 2 young women in their 20s shared the place. One worked mornings at a clinic, the other was finishing a degree and kept odd hours studying late. They were close enough to tell secrets and close enough to tell each other when something felt off. One night, one roommate woke at the edge of sleep to a weight at the foot of the bed. She assumed it was the other girl, a warm presence settling in. She rolled over and whispered a sleepy, "Hey, stop stealing the covers." There was a small shift, then quiet. In the morning she asked about it, and the roommate blinked, confused. She'd been out until 2 a.m., proof smoking at a bar with friends. The landlord later mentioned, almost in passing, that decades before someone had died in that building, no details, only a shadow of a memory from old newspaper clippings the landlord kept in a drawer. Over the following months, the woman who had felt the weight began to have trouble telling dreams from reality. She would be in the kitchen and feel a hand on her shoulder, only to find empty air. Once, she found a note on the table, small and childlike, the looping letters spelling play. No cameras showed anyone entering. The roommates installed a motion sensor as a joke. It never tripped. They laughed about it with friends, the nervous laughter of people trying to make the strange manageable. Later, the tenant found out, through a neighbor who pieced together old records, that someone had died alone in the very apartment above the deli years before, a person who'd battled depression and had been known to spend long nights wandering the streets. The tenant handled it carefully when she told me, the way someone discusses a private illness, with sadness and the hope that recounting it might not make it worse. She moved out 6 months later. Even now, she says she'll sometimes wake and feel a pressure on her chest that fades when she reaches for the light. That was a small, private echo. Wait until you hear what happened when a child's voice started answering in a house nobody expected it to. 3. A modest split level in the suburbs. A young family, mother, father, and a 3-year-old daughter recently moved in. The mother worked from home and noted the house's odd angles, long hallways, narrow staircases, a high landing that caught summer light like a slice of honey. In the second week, pictures of the family were arranged on a shelf. The child's drawings brightened an otherwise ordinary hallway. One afternoon, the mother left the room and returned to find those pictures removed from the shelf and placed with patient care on the floor facing the wall. The frames weren't broken, no fingerprints smudged the glass. The daughter insisted she hadn't touched them. That night the mother was in the kitchen when she heard her daughter giggling in the hallway, except the sound came from a different, thinner voice, a child's voice that called, "Mommy!" from the top of the stairs. The little girl was asleep in her room. Terrified, the mother checked every room. The house was empty but for their 3 small, breathing bodies. She asked the child in the morning if she had called for her, and the child looked bewildered and said, "No, the other girl was talking." The parents searched online and learned, only by piecing together an old real estate listing and a local history forum, that the plot the house now sat on had once belonged to a small parish and a burial site that had been moved decades before. Not much of the church remained, just a marker in an old map someone had scanned and posted, but the idea lodged in their minds like a splinter. Over months, the occurrences increased, but never violent. Toys rearranged into careful lines, a tiny chair pulled out and left centered on the landing. Sometimes the child would answer questions that she shouldn't know the answer to. Names of people who never lived there, names that sounded old and worn. They called a neighbor who told them quietly that she once heard church bells in that area at night when no church existed anymore. The family moved when the lease ended, but the mother says she still wakes to the feeling of someone leaning against the kitchen doorframe at night, patient and small. That house kept its odd, tender patterns. The next story moves to a far richer setting, where the past is heavier and more layered. An old mansion with more secrets than rooms. 4. A large, faded mansion on the coast, sun-bleached stone, terraces that looked like spilled lace. A guest at a weekend party, visiting with friends who had inherited the place. The house had been used for different things over its life. A private residence, then wartime quarters, then a tawdry rental. There were attic doors that no one opened, and a smell of old paper that clung to the library. One night, a group of friends were drunk and reckless enough to climb the back stairs to the locked attic. Someone forced the door, and they stepped into an attic layered with dust and stacked trunks. In the half-dark, the woman who told me the story heard a voice, soft, human, a whisper-like breath, call out a name she didn't know. It wasn't in her direction. It seemed to come from behind a cedar trunk, as if an old thing, hiding under an old thing, had decided to be heard. They laughed at first. A friend flicked on a tiny flashlight. Beams cut through the dust, the particles spinning like a slow galaxy. When the light landed on the floorboards, they saw scuff marks, recent scuffs, small and shallow, as if someone had paced there in bare feet. The friends left, the bravado fading into a shared, uneasy silence. After the weekend, one guest reported hearing footsteps above her room at night, light and shuffling like someone searching through trunks. Another woke to the sound of someone humming an old lullaby down the hall. a melody half remembered. Later, when researching the mansion's history, they learned the building had been requisitioned during the war as a billet for soldiers and had at one point housed a small infirmary. Records were patchy, but footnotes mentioned a makeshift morgue set up in the cellar during a particular winter. They avoided the attic after that. The woman who told me moved out of town the next year. She admits she doesn't know whether the house remembered certain footsteps or if people carried the weight of rumor into their imaginations. But she still wakes sometimes, certain she hears a soft humming that isn't coming from inside her head. Hospitality in that house turned brittle. 5. A long Victorian in a small town with carved newel posts and a porch that sagged where people rocked their days away. A family lived there for generations. An elderly aunt stayed until late in her life and sometimes sat in the parlor gazing at nothing. The current occupants, young parents with a teen, had photographs of great-grandparents on the mantel and a sense that the house preferred silence. One evening, the teenage son was alone with the family dog on the first floor. The dog stared at the doorway to the kitchen, tail still, eyes locked. The teen followed the dog's gaze and saw, for a breath, the pale outline of an old woman in the doorway. Grey hair pinned back, clothes that hung like faded maps. She was not detailed, only a suggestion, like charcoal smudged on glass. The teen blinked. When he looked again, the doorway was empty. He called for his mother, who arrived and found him sitting on the floor, pale and shaking. He tried to explain, but his words tangled. A few nights later, the mother was sorting glasses in the kitchen, and one slipped from her hand. It shattered in a thin spray of crystal right against her palm. She hadn't cut herself, but there was a startling sense that the glass had chosen that moment. The family began reporting small bruises, marks like pinches on bare skin, with no memory of how they'd happened. The teen developed a dread of the hallway at night. He would cross quickly, head down, not wanting to linger. Stories from neighbors filled in the edges. The aunt who had sat in the parlor had been known to mutter to someone unseen, and once when she died, a neighbor swore the parlor light had turned on by itself, although no electricity had been used in days during a storm. The house kept certain people close to it, for reasons no one could explain. They sold the house years later. Buyers would remark at how quiet the parlor felt, as if an old presence had simply stepped out and left the room to breathe. The family still talks about the way windows seem to watch them, a feeling like breath at the nape of the neck. The teen sleeps differently now, on his back, hands locked behind his head, as if to check there's nothing pressing down on his chest. That was an apparition that watched more than it spoke. Next is a story of touch, of pressure, and a whisper that could be felt more than heard. 6. A farmhouse out in the country, where the road ends in gravel and the nearest neighbor is minutes away. A couple bought it to escape city noise. They loved the creaks and the way light moved through the fields. On a night, thick with summer, the wife woke to a pressure on the bed, like someone sitting before rising. At first she thought it was her husband turning over, but his breathing was steady and the weight was on the opposite side. She reached for the bedside lamp and felt the mattress dip as if a body had shifted toward the edge. She turned on the light and found the bed empty. The window curtains were still, the moon a flat coin in the sky. She lay awake for hours, feeling watched in a house that had been designed for privacy. The next morning, she found a small, neat bruise on her shoulder, barely noticeable, but impossible to explain by clumsiness or remembered incident. Over the following weeks, the couple reported more touches, a light tug at a blanket, a faint breath at the back of a neck, the unmistakable sensation of fingers closing around a wrist and releasing lightly. Once, the wife felt the pillow beside her being pulled away during the night, as if something had sat up and left. She woke, climbed out of bed, and saw the pillow displaced on the floor. When she picked it up, there were fresh, small marks, as if someone had pinched the stuffing, though how anyone could do that without waking them was a question no one could answer. They tried rational things, new locks, a sound system that played white noise, keeping the dog in the bedroom. Nothing stopped the pressure. Over time, the wife developed a wariness that settled into her bones. She stopped sleeping on her back. Close friends suggested medication, rest, a counselor. She pursued each option, not out of conviction that anything supernatural was happening, but because the experience was relentless and exhausting. They stayed for a year, then decided to rent the farmhouse while keeping their things in storage. The wife still finds herself checking the pillow corners when she sleeps at a hotel. She says the habit calmed her, even if it didn't erase the memory of the night. Something sat at the edge of the bed and left a bruise like a fingerprint. That pattern, something intimate at the edge of sleep, turns up again and again. It isn't always malevolent, sometimes it's merely intrusive, but it changes the way people live in their homes. If you thought that was unnerving, there's one that centers on repeating sounds, knocks that answer knocks, and it will make you listen to your own walls a little differently. 7. An English village cottage, centuries old, narrow and low-ceilinged, where winters made the hearth the center of life. A retired schoolteacher lived there alone after her husband passed, the house full of books, teacups stacked like quiet witnesses, and curtains that smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs. She began to notice a pattern late in the year, a rhythm of knocks, usually 3, and always in the small hours. The sound came from somewhere between the front door and the narrow side window, a polite, measured tapping that never matched the cadence of a practical visitor. She would wake, sit up and listen. The first night she put her ear to the floor and heard nothing else. The walls themselves seemed to hold the sound and pass it along like a secret. On another occasion, the knocks came as a reply. She had heard a distant tap on her kitchen window and on a whim rapped twice in return. The tapping on the other side answered in 3 even strokes she hadn't expected. It felt like a conversation she had not been invited to join. Attic sounds followed. On windy afternoons when leaves scraped the eaves, she would swear she could hear light footsteps above her head, soft, pacing steps that sometimes aligned with a sense of someone standing at the top of the narrow stairs. Once, while she was making tea, the kettle hissed and the footsteps paused for a long, deliberate moment above the landing. She called up, "Is someone there?" And a silence answered her that felt heavier than any noise. When she climbed the dark stairs later that day, the attic was empty, but for old trunks, and a single pair of child's shoes tucked into a corner, the laces neatly tied, though nobody in her family had worn them in decades. Neighbors had stories of their own. An old builder who remembered the house being part of a row of cottages that once sheltered seasonal workers. A local historian who mentioned that during a cold winter decades earlier, a family had lost a child to fever, and the cottage had been tended by those who could. The teacher felt the story like a bruise. She did not trust the certainty of the past, only the way the house kept knocking, keeping the past from vanishing. She began to sleep with a shawl across her knees, a habit that made more sense to her than formal explanation. The knocking never became violent. It stayed polite, persistent, like a visitor who refused to leave. In the aftermath, she rearranged furniture so she could see both the stairs and the window from bed, and found herself listening for a pattern of 3 in every ordinary sound. It altered the cadence of her days. Silence was no longer restful, but pregnant with potential reply. That small, persistent knocking felt almost conversational, but conversation can be unnerving when you realize someone has been listening long after you thought the room was empty. 8. A modest ranch house in New Hampshire, set against a stand of pines, where winter snow could blank out the world for days. A young couple had bought it with plans to nest and raise a child, simple plans framed by the wood stove and the steep, comforting roofline. They noticed a shadow first, not fully formed, gliding across the den in the wan light of late afternoons. It moved with a kind of purpose, crossing the length of the room and pausing as if to survey a chair or a doorway. The husband thought at first it was neighbourly light, a reflection from a truck passing on the road, but the shadow cut through the middle of a lampshade and did not change with the lamp's position. Then, on a night when the wife was home alone and the wind had a thin edge to it, she saw the shadow emblem take on a colour she couldn't name, an odd green wash, like the shimmer of an old mercury glass ornament. The green light seemed to pass through the figure's chest, then slide off it into the air, a slow, unnatural glow that left her skin prickling. The figure crossed the den and paused at the doorway to the hallway, where it seemed to hesitate as if listening. It moved with human-like economy, shoulders shifting as if to step into the kitchen. But when she blinked, there was only the empty hallway and a faint smear on the rug, as though someone had brushed past. The couple began leaving small gifts by the threshold, plates of bread, an extra blanket, petty offerings against a stranger they could not name. Sometimes they would come downstairs to find these things rearranged, a plate moved from the bench to the floor, an extra sock tucked under the doormat. The husband, practical and not easily shaken, set up motion-activated lights for the den. They came on when he crossed, as any sensible light would, but never lit when the shadow passed. Cameras that recorded in the black-and-white blur of night saw nothing but an unaccountable dip in pixels, a momentary fuzz where the den should be. When he slowed the footage, artifacts appeared, a faint ripple like breath on glass, and then a tiny, sharp movement as if the house itself had inhaled. They stopped trying to rationalize the color and the way the figure ignored their technology. The house had its own rules. They sold the house before their first child was born. Even after moving to newer walls and better insulation, the wife would sometimes stand in their living room and find her eyes tracing the quivering outline of a green light in the corner, as if expecting it to pass through the couch. She keeps a nightlight in the hallway now, not because she's convinced the figure will return, but because the memory rearranged how she allowed darkness in her home. The shadow didn't hurt them. It merely claimed certain spaces and left the couple to negotiate the rest. 9. A cramped studio apartment in a city that smelled of rain and takeaway food. It was 1998 when a man in his 20s rented the unit, the kind of place with a single window that looked out on a brick alley and an espresso machine on the counter that never stopped hissing. Night after night, he woke to the clatter of the kitchen, sounds of pans searing and utensils tossed as if a dinner party had erupted when he slept. He would stumble out, barefoot and half-dreaming, to find the sink empty and the stove cold. Plates were neatly stacked, as if someone had cleared up and left on purpose. Once he found the cupboard door ajar and the few packets of instant noodles arranged by colour on the shelf. The city was noisy and strange noises could be blamed on neighbours, but he lived on the top floor. Footsteps from above were impossible. He thought of rodents at first, or stray cats that could jump the fire escapes, but everything suggested a human hand with a careful touch. That winter he began having the same dream. He was trapped in a kitchen that burned without flame, a smell like charred paper and the distant vague impression of skin that had been exposed to heat. The dream would leave him with a taste like metal and a sudden fear of mirrors. One night, waking from that dream, he saw in the apartment window not the street, but a reflected silhouette, a dark figure standing just behind him. When he spun around, there was nothing but the small bed and the dent where he'd been sleeping. Looking back at the window, the glass showed only the alley. He developed a habit of draping a towel over the window at night, as if denying the reflection could deny the presence. The man moved out in the spring, but not before he spent a week attempting to document the kitchen noises with an old cassette recorder. The tapes played back with gaps, snatches of ordinary apartment hum, and then a thin, high-frequency whining that his ears couldn't distinguish. The dream did not stop immediately. It became less frequent, but it left him with an instinctive caution. He never again placed his back to a window when he slept. The experience left an imprint on how he used light and reflection, the kinds of small adjustments that feel rational until you remember the taste of metal in your mouth upon waking. The city keeps its echoes. Sometimes they live in cramped apartments, and sometimes they wait in the panes of windows, patient and reflective. 10. A cedar-sided house on the shore of a northern Michigan lake, the kind of place where children were allowed to run wild and summer camps thinned into memory. A woman told this one to me, beginning that she'd been seeing shapes since she was 8, a childhood of silhouettes and slow, looping nightmares. She said the sighting started small, a dark blot at the edge of a doorway, the sense someone watched from the woods when the house was full of summer cousins. As she grew, the forms sharpened into what she called shadow people, figures that gathered just out of reach in the corners of rooms. They didn't speak. They moved like the impression left by someone in a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. At night, she would wake convinced her bedroom ceiling had been skimmed by bats. Once a bat actually did find a way through an old vent and startled everyone, but the woman says the way the shadow people reacted to the bat was the strangest thing. They pulled back as if the winged creature had offended them, then returned a moment later to their old posts at the window frame. The nightmares that folded her sleep into daydreams were cinematic, repeat sequences where she ran the length of the house and always came to the same red front door, always turned the knob to find only darkness. Each dream ended with a loop of light, a flash of a corridor that felt both ordinary and set apart, and then waking on a car ride home or in a classroom, the feeling trailing behind her like a perfume. The shadows in waking life reacted too. Once, while she sat on the porch reading, the air cooled and the shadows in the living room tilted toward the doorway as if listening. Her dogs would sometimes fix their stares on a place no human could see, a small collective unease that she learned to trust. As an adult, she moved away for college and then returned to care for her aging parents, but the shadows had become a part of domestic life. She learned to put bright quilts over sofas at night and to hang wind chimes in the eaves to catch whatever attention the dark figures paid. Friends suggested therapy, allergies, overactive imagination. None of that erased the sensation of being watched in a house that had seen generations. She avoids certain rooms now, especially during long, windless nights when the house seems to exhale. She says the shadows didn't follow her so much as they remained, tied to the house like a habit its walls refused to break. They never harmed her physically. Their threat was a kind of persistent presence, a slow wearing that shaped the decisions a person makes about where to live and how to sleep. 11. An 1840 farmhouse in central Oregon, settled into a wide, dry plain with scrub and distant hills. Inside, a communal household had formed, 12 roommates in a patchwork of renters and friends who treated the house like a cooperative experiment in living. It was loud and chaotic, and exactly the setting you would expect for something to pick out a single voice. One of the roommates, a shy man who worked as a barista and kept odd hours, would often come home late. He began to hear a whispered phrase whenever the house fell quiet. "He's coming," thin and urgent, as if the words had been rehearsed in a throat that was not quite human. The whisper didn't belong to any of the 12 roommates. They each swore to have never said it, and grew defensive when he repeated the line out loud. The whisper seemed to stalk him, surfacing in the kitchen at 3 a.m. Across the parking lot when he took the trash out, in the old garage where they kept bicycles dangling like fossilized things. One night he and 2 friends decided to wait up and catch whatever was making the voice. They sat on the living room floor with mugs of coffee and a cheap tape recorder between them. As the house sank into a hush, a pressure rose in the room and the recorder emitted a thin, static hum. Then the whisper came, farther away than normal, through a wall or an open window, and was followed by a sound like someone pressing a palm to glass. The three of them shone flashlights at the back window and saw an inky black silhouette press against the pane from the outside, a shape too dark to show any detail, only a denser absence that puddled at the bottom of the glass. They opened the back door slowly and found nothing but footprints in the dirt, ending as if whoever had made them had stepped off into air. That winter, the house was hit by rodent problems and leaks, and some of the more practical roommates blamed those issues for making the place feel haunted. But the whisper continued to single out that one man who grew into a cautious person because of it. He left the house the next spring, claiming he couldn't shake the memory of the voice that had repeatedly told him someone was approaching. Afterward, the roommates kept in touch, and while most laughed about the ghost roommate story at parties, the man who'd been whispered to admitted he still flinched when someone said the word "coming" near a closed door. The house had picked him in a way that changed which doors he trusted. Crowded houses attract attention. Some presences seem to prefer noise. Others pick a single, quieter person and hold on. 12. A house near a campus town, old, with a deep front porch and a basement that had been converted into a study. A group of undergraduates rented it during the school year and treated the basement as neutral ground, a place for late-night debates, pizza boxes, and the low light of televisions more than books. During finals week, when the house was thin and sleep was rationed, the tenants began hearing horror movie timing, coordinated knocks that started at the same time outside 3 separate doors, each knock followed by a slam far down the corridor. They ran to check, which meant they were waking each other in a domino pattern, each run to the door making the knocking more dramatic. Once after one of these episodes, someone reported hearing the cry of a baby from the basement, soft, insistent, and entirely out of context in a house of adults with no infants. The sound dissolved into static when they turned on the lamps. That basement had been part storage, part study, and part a forgotten space where things were left. An old rocking chair remained in a corner, its paint flaked and its springs tired. During one episode, the chair rocked slowly, though no one sat in it, and a small, pacifier-like object appeared on the landing. No one could account for it. The students joked about pranks. One of them admitted later she had a friend who loved practical jokes, but the timing and the coordinated nature of the knocks suggested someone had access to multiple entry points, or the house itself was orchestrating the sound. One night, a pair of roommates stayed awake to catch whatever made the baby sound. They crawled down to the basement and sat in the dark. The sound came, a faint, rhythmic wail, and then the basement lights flicked on by themselves just above them, bathing the old wallpaper in a cold glare. They left the house that night and stayed in a campus dorm, the memory of the baby's cry following them like a small, persistent guilt. Students moved in and out each semester. The house retained its reputation. People who visited would sometimes refuse to go into the basement alone. Years later, one of the alums told me she still awoke from time to time, imagining the rocking chair moving in a house she hadn't lived in for a decade. The incidents hadn't escalated into anything physically dangerous, but they turned a shared home into a place remembered for its odd, manufactured interruptions. Some houses choose to perform for the people inside them. Some people carry that performance away. 13. A converted funeral home on the edge of a New Zealand town. This house was unusual from the start, a stately building with high ceilings, a wide staircase, and a history that was, in the local telling, layered and complicated. A woman who grew up there described childhood memories that sounded like the residue of a place designed to hold grief. Her earliest recollections were of whispers at the foot of her bed that were not in English, voices that braided together in languages her parents did not speak. When she asked about them years later, adults in the town were evasive. The building had been used for funeral services for decades before being turned into a family home. Records showed its rooms sometimes held people who had recently died before funeral arrangements, but details were sparse and handed off with careful language. She recalled a figure that would stand at the top of the stairs, tall, wrapped in a coat that looked like hospital linens, face never visible, the presence more sorrowful than menacing. As a child, she learned not to run past that figure. Adults said she had a particular sensitivity. The family ignored the house's history in practical ways: renovations, repainting, a bright kitchen in which to eat breakfast. But history is patient. As the woman grew older, she would sometimes find objects arranged as if someone had been tidying. An old hymn book placed precisely on a mantel, a pair of gloves folded at the end of a hallway. When she spent nights alone, she heard a low hum that seemed like a choir tuning up in another room, a sound that never resolved into words but left an ache in her chest. Friends teased that the house had good manners, a gentle way of reminding its inhabitants of what it had been. What changed the most, she says, was how the house shaped her sense of trauma and loss. When someone close to her died later in life, the house's whispers were the closest they'd come to comfort, strange but steady. She chose to live in that house as an adult for reasons she couldn't fully justify, a decision born of a desire to be anchored in a place that remembered. It didn't heal her. Nothing can promise that. But the house's persistence forced her to accept that grief can be a resident as much as a visitor. In the aftermath, she kept candles in narrow windows and an old hymn book on her shelf. She never claimed to fully understand why voices echoed in languages she didn't know, only that the house had a memory she could sometimes hear. Living there taught her to be gentle with silence and to listen for the lives a building might shelter. Homes remember in different tongues. Coda. 13 houses, 13 ways of folding the past into the present. Some of these stories are about sound, some are about shadow, touch, or a residual habit of a place that refuses to let go. The thread that winds through them is not a certificate of proof, but a pattern. The domestic space, kitchen, attic, basement, bed, becomes a stage where small, persistent anomalies make themselves known, and where people adapt in ways that change their habits, their sleep, and sometimes the shape of their lives. None of these tellers insisted they had found a conclusive answer. Many offered proposed explanations: old plumbing, pranksters, an overactive imagination, grief, the way a house remembers. But every explanation landed soft against the edges of what they had experienced. That uncertainty is part of the point. Houses can be repositories of memory and of long, quiet processes we don't have names for. They can be pockets in which sound lingers and shapes a life. They can be the sort of thing that makes a person sleep with the light on, or keep a recorder running through the night. Small acts of defiance against whatever else might be listening. I don't know which of these stories you will dismiss and which will sit in your bones like a splinter. I do know that homes are not always neutral, and that the ways we respond reveal as much about us as the events themselves. There's a hum of compassion in many of these accounts: a neighbor bringing a casserole, someone moving out to find peace, a person keeping a small ritual to feel safer. And that human tenderness is what keeps these stories from becoming mere curiosities. They are about people who had to renegotiate the most ordinary parts of their days because a house insisted on speaking. So, take tonight's chill and fold it into whatever you already believe. Leave a light on if that makes sense. Check the corners of your room sometimes. Don't claim to know more than the tellers did. And if one of these stories landed with you, share it with someone who likes the small, unsettling things that crawl at the edge of sleep. If these kept you awake, subscribe for more late-night tales, and check the description for today's trailer and timestamps so you can jump to any story. Thank you for listening, for lending your ears to these houses and the people who live in them. Some doors close quietly, some remain open, waiting to be remembered. One last thing. When you turn out your light tonight, listen for 3 knocks, polite, persistent, and remember that in some houses, someone might still be answering.